Are there any other questions? If not, then I think we will move to session 5C, which actually says, well, there's all this stuff we can do inside the labor force surveys and PALMs and whatever, but there's also quite a lot of cross-checking that we've done with other data, and what does that raise? So we're going to begin with Andrew.
Talking about various types of other data. So I approached this from a slightly different angle to the way that Martin talked about it, or introduced it, not necessarily cross-checking, but trying to think about data quality issues using alternative sources of data. So I have done some of the work that Martin's talked about, using SARS data, for example, cross-checking SARS, GHS, and LFS. I don't have any of that in here, but that's a nice example. Martin wasn't allowed the very top earners tax data because he got it on a CD. Won't say anything more about that, but anyway, it was on a CD. And then he had the top 500 or so people where he got some aggregate statistics about those people. So if you go to Pretoria and sit on the secure data center, you get everyone. You're just not allowed to, there's no top coding or anything. You're just not allowed to show like the top person's earnings is, and they are a male and they're, 57 years old or whatever. That's going to be disclosive. So yeah, you can get all of the data. And one of the things that I've been doing is and still doing is trying to do some comparisons between the tax data and QLFS and the GHS because of the QLFS problems. So I guess in the spirit of reviewing the work of DataFirst, that's the sort of aim or focus of these next few slides. So I'm talking about the QES, the quarterly employment statistics, which is a firm survey. I'm talking about the tax data, and talking about a few slides on other surveys. So funny story. 2013 DataFirst workshop, we invited someone senior from Stats South Africa. I made a rude comment about the fact that we knew little about the QES, and particularly, it's a firm survey, it wasn't publicly available, and we got given that data on a memory stick. It wasn't on CD, but it was on a memory stick. And so that's how we came to do some work on the QES. That was just kind of like luck. Well, I guess Martin invited the person, so that was cool. That was one step, but after that, definitely luck that we got that data. So enabled us to answer some interesting questions that people hadn't answered before, because there just wasn't data. And we did try, talked about public good and making data publicly available. We did try quite hard to ask Stats South Africa to put the data into our secure data center so that other people could come and use it. And unfortunately, we didn't manage to persuade them to do that. So that was disappointing. A few findings from this really interesting survey. So it's a panel of firms. The sample frame comes from the tax register. So Stats SA and SARS collaborate, and that Stats SA has a list of all the current tax-paying firms, and it samples from that list to create these formal sector surveys. That's the ones in economic statistics that would be used for GDP purposes, and then also the QES, which is for employment, mainly for employment. It asks a very few simple questions to firms: total employment in the last few months, total wage bill, and not much other than that. And we just focused on employment in this paper. So the aim was to look at job creation and destruction in firms. So how much movement is there in firms' employment levels over time? It's a quarterly panel, so you can observe the firms in multiple quarters and look at the changes in their employment. And this has been done for a lot of other countries. Davis and Hiltwanger, 1996 or 5 is the key paper, and we kind of replicated that study, which there are now many in a lot of different countries, and found that job creation and destruction levels were similar to the OECD country average, but lower than in other transition countries and Latin America. But so that was kind of interesting in and of itself, that we got a new source of data, but also raised some data quality issues, which we mentioned. I mean, my question to the person was, we don't know anything about the quality of data. And so one of the things we talked about quite a lot in the paper is actually the QS looks pretty good. You know, it's an interesting survey. This is, you know, documenting things that don't usually get out into Status A data releases, which are mainly very high level. This is the employment in this quarter, and you know, this is employment in that quarter, and broadly speaking, this is how the sample is, you know, sample frame is sorted, and etc. So, for example, it turns out that Stats South Africa keeps the firms in for a large number of years and doesn't replenish the sample, so it could be up to 4 or 5 years. And so if you're thinking that some job creation is coming from the fact that new firms are being born, they'll be registered, they'll grow, that is then missed in the surveys. So for a period of 4 or 5 years, the QES is only capturing firm deaths. So firm is dying, it's exiting. Stats SA will try and interview that firm, it'll get a missing or a 0, and then it'll drop out. But on the other side, the firm births is not very well captured, other than, and then you start the panel again, and then Stats SA will get a list of all the newly created firms, and that'll then show up. So you'll get actually something that probably isn't unlike what the jumps around that Nicola and Amy and Martin have been investigating. Very different cause, but you'll see kind of maybe growth in employment, but there's nothing happening, no contribution from firm births. And then when there's a new sample frame, all the newly birthed firms over the last 5 years will then start to show up. So that's kind of an interesting issue that comes out of sampling that's related to data quality. So I don't have much to say else on the QES. A little bit on SARS. The SARS IRP5 data, that's people's tax certificates for employees. That's the data that I've spent a lot of time working on. There's also information on companies, so how much tax returns of companies. That's not something that I've spent a lot of time on. But so we submitted a proposal to work on this data, sort of luckily a step after the QES firm data. We now had firm data again. We knew somebody's tax certificate, we'll say Andrew and UCT as the employer. And so we know the firm identifier and the worker identifier, and those are constant over time. They're anonymized, so we don't know it's Andrew and UCT. We just know it's person 1 and firm 1. And so we could think about how much movement there is of workers between firms. And the kind of big picture finding on that paper is that worker flows are relatively high in South Africa. There's quite a lot of movement of people between firms, which is perhaps a little bit surprising if you think that the labor market in South Africa is rigid. Then you'd expect firms being very cautious to hire people because maybe they can't fire them. And so you'd maybe find a lot less flows than in other countries. So it's not like we have very high flows, but we're also not an outlier in the other direction. So just one table from that paper, the one that was most striking to me when I was reviewing this is we've got the earnings quintiles of the workers, and these are the job flow rates for each of the different quintiles. I'll just take 2014 and I'll interpret this. So first earnings quintile is people who are earning between people in the first earnings quintile, those who are earning less than 80% of the other people who are earning above them, and their worker flow rate is about just close to 0.96. So what that means is, of all of those people, your colleagues, if you're earning that amount of money, you're in the bottom quintile, 50% of the people who are in your firms or in firms earning that amount, less than 2,700 Rand per month, will be gone in the next year. So you're sitting with a group of people, and of those people, 50% will have disappeared and gone to another employer or exited to non-employment. So that's kind of massive. You're sitting around with a group of people, your colleagues, low earning people, and half of them are going to disappear in a year's time, either to another firm or out of employment or out of formal employment. And you can see that that number is, well, these are, you've got to divide these by 2. That's what I'm doing to get the 50%. So that's 48 and that's 13%. So for the top 20% of earners, you're sitting with a group of your relatively well-off top 20%, and only 13% of them are going to have left to go to another firm in a year's time. So again, if you're thinking about labor market rigidities and who's protected and who isn't, it's kind of striking that there's so much more movement going on at the bottom than there is at the top, which is, I think, true in other places. It's not South Africa specific, but it is just interesting that it is so dramatic. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. Yeah, so there was lots of interesting things that I learned in 2015 going to Pretoria and sitting on those servers. I managed to crash the National Treasury server for a few minutes by doing, what was it? Merge one massive data set with another one. So that was the iDrive. The iDrive wasn't accessible at some point. But so yeah, I also had to learn how to use big data and Stata. So unfortunately, I've not learned R. Or other SAS or something else that can do better with big data sets. But that was kind of interesting, learning how to use a big data set. But there's some kind of big cons as well. So, you know, you can look at the top of the earnings distribution, but, and this is something that I don't know the answer to, there's, I think it's 15–20% of the people in each year have earnings less than 2,000 per year. So there's a whole lot of people sitting on very low earnings, including people, many that are sitting on exactly R1. And so my solution to that has just been, this has got to throw this away. And I think other people have done something similar. But if you're thinking about inequality, if you're comparing the number of people in the tax data to the number of people in the QLFS who look like they should be in the tax data, that number is quite a lot lower. So perhaps firms are somehow putting people onto the books as R1 when they should actually be, you know, they did actually get paid some proper wage. I don't know. That data has taught me, and more especially the people working on the firms and the company income tax returns, that we need to talk to more accountants. Yeah, which that's not something I didn't ever study accounting in my life. Yeah, so there's lots of pros, but there are also some important cons. And you know, big data is going to replace surveys. You know, there's no place for surveys in the world. I think using that admin data taught me that, sure, there's some big advantages, but don't, you know, don't throw away surveys, because there's a whole lot of things, you know, at my when I was doing the work, there was no age, there was no gender, there's kind of very little information in the tax data. Now there's a bit more, but you know, the big one is race. We don't have information about race in the tax data, and that's, you know, obviously a big part of the South African story. And if you're missing that, then you're missing, if I'm talking about inequality, I'm missing some really important parts about inequality. And what's cool is that I've been able to continue to provide some information and help to the data creation team at WIDA. Yeah. Okay, one other plug for a variety of different sources. I hope that in 5 years' time, we'll have created the OHS, GHS version of Palms. I've got there slowly by just focusing on the labor market stuff. I've been doing that for the last few years, but just as a plug, the GHS, it's run annually. It's a nice addition or complement to the QLFS, especially with the QLFS having the problems with the earnings data. It doesn't have the job and employment stuff that the QLFS does, doesn't ask questions about hours worked. So it's not great. It's not a replacement for the QLFS, but it's certainly kind of interesting and important. And it's got tons of other stuff, basic income information beyond earnings. So it's got actually quite a lot of data. It looks pretty reasonable compared to the IESs and LCSs that really spend a lot more time focusing on income. So I think it's an underutilized source of data. If anyone's looking for a new interesting topic to work on, I'm sure you can find one in the GHS. And one strange thing I've noticed is that there's more employment in the GHS than the QLFS, which is strange. Considering the QLFS is the kind of labor-focused survey, we should be getting things right. Although I've already told you we're not getting things right on earnings. I don't know which is right on employment, but there's more employment in the GHS than in the QLFS. And I'm not sure that anyone's done anything on the GHS now, which exists for 2020 and 2021. Sure, there's big non-response rate. I think it's 40%. They were, yeah, they had a worse sample frame than the QLFS to start with. But yeah, I think there's interesting information that can be found in those surveys, especially if we're worrying about QLFS and COVID, etc. And then just one last bullet point on some other surveys. There's now 3 travel surveys that ask very similar earnings questions to the QLFS and GHS. So, you know, there's lots of other data floating around. Mornay and others have already mentioned PIES, the IES and LCS. And then there's, I mentioned CESI earlier on. There's, I don't know that it's in the public QLFS data, but there's definitely a paper looking at, you know, very important and currently in South Africa, looking at earnings and employment of migrants and non-migrants. So that data was asked about in the QLFS. It's one of these piggybacking surveys like CESI, and it's, as far as I know, there's one ILO paper that's used that data, and that's about it. So yeah, there's lots of interesting sources of data out there. We've used and thought about some of them as part of DataFirst's broad data quality work, and yeah, I guess given a different angle on some of these things to that which you can get from the household surveys. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
I just meant during COVID, so not in general. The QLFS asked lots of detail, it asked questions about people's phone numbers from only 3 months before. The GHS was a full year before. And so it was just harder to contact people, I think. And I don't think they made as much of an effort as the QLFS to collect people's phone numbers. So that's why I think they had a worse response rate, because they just didn't have as recent or as good data on contacts as.
And I think one of the realities is that I think there's more money in Stats SA going into the QLFS operations than to the GHS. I mean, it's kind of a set of priorities that is fair enough. Okay, so basically, I'm going to be talking to 2 additional sources. So this is also a part of my effort at, you know, kind of like excavating stuff we did. So I'm going to talk about a paper which appeared in the SAJE in 2004, which actually predates the data quality project, but couldn't have been done without the help of Lynn. So it actually really belongs to DataFirst as much as me. And what I did was very simple. I mean, it's actually, the reason why I always want to talk about it is kind of like the paper nobody reads, actually. It's got like a sum total, I think, of 1 citation anywhere. Andrew's just told me he's cited it, so that would make it 2, kind of like. And I'm kind of flummoxed by that, because it's not a difficult paper, but it has some really disturbing implications. So what did I do? Well, these firm surveys back in the day were called censuses. So there's and now they're called big big surveys, but the census idea was that basically they really do try to get the top end of pretty much the entire manufacturing establishment, and they get samples of the rest. So anyway, in 1996, we have a manufacturing census, we have a population census, we have an October household survey, and we can just cross-check. Very simple question, like what do the manufacturing numbers look like in those three surveys? And spoiler alert, oh no, they're not on the same page, kind of like, so I don't have a good reason for that, but that's what the paper says. So now that I've told you what it is, you don't need to read it, but so here's table 1 from the paper. So basically I do this by statistical region. So this is just the top and the bottom spliced together. So we see that in the Cape Town district, there are 168,000 roughly workers enumerated in the manufacturing census, but the population census only picks up 145,000. Okay, so and basically you go through, the bottom row has the overall aggregates for the country. There's 1.4 million manufacturing workers in the manufacturing census and only 1.1 million in the population census. That's not what's called a small difference. That's 300,000 people that got lost, okay? And I spend a lot of effort in the paper trying to work out, well, where could they be? I mean, do we have explanation? I'm not going to go through that. Turns out there are no good reasons for why they disappeared, because typically the other thing is that we would think that the firms would be, you know, they would have maybe an incentive, particularly in 96. This is just after the change, not to fully disclose, like, you know, sort of like casual work, you know, in case with changing labor laws, whatever, maybe people are going to come after them. Now, you can't see why firms would have an incentive in reporting more workers than they do. It's also hard to think that if you're asking somebody in, there are all sorts of reasons why you can have misclassification in the population census. But manufacturing, it's not like one of these service sector type of things where it's, you know, if you're bloody in a big factory, I mean, you know, you should be able to get that straight. So if we cross-check this by province, because you can't really drill the household surveys down to the much more local level. Yeah, so actually I also look at the geography, and the geography all suggests that it's kind of like suspicious that we can't find these workers. So here we now take 3 OHSs. 96 was a bit odd because it was a smaller OHS. It was linked to the population census through the post-enumeration survey. So I've put the October household surveys from either side, 95 and 97, with confidence bands, 95% confidence intervals around there. And the question here is, do the numbers appear in the confidence interval? And in a significant number of cases, even though those confidence intervals are pretty big, they don't. This is the 97, 96, 1, 2, you know, these are very big. And when you look at the details, it turns out that the survey data also doesn't quite talk to the national census data. Sort of like, you know, so basically if you look at the other categories like agricultural workers and whatever. So that's the sum total of the papers, that, like, you know, we don't know what the hell's going on. It is the sort of stuff that I think we should be spending more time trying to figure out, like, you know, why do different surveys, you know, like, in a sense, are we looking at the same reality, or or if not, what is that telling us about the lenses through which we're actually looking? Then the next is the tax data. So yeah, this wasn't the same data that Andrew was using in the lab. This was tax assessment data, and it didn't come in an envelope that somebody dropped off mysteriously in the reception. It came through the ready channel, so it was a formal. The tax people knew I had it, kind of like so. What? No, it sounded super dodgy the way you described it, kind of like, you know, in a parking lot meeting Deep Throat, kind of. So yeah, so that was written up in a ready working paper, which, yeah, so the ready working paper is there, but again, I haven't taken it anywhere since then. So one of the big issues in looking at these two sources of data is that, yeah, you have to make them comparable. So this is assessments data. So this is kind of like basically a sample, the top end with some additional people of the tax distribution. And one of the problems is actually finding out who's a wage earner in the tax data. So because basically getting all sources of earnings in the tax data, you have to kind of figure out who of them would have been in the QLFS an employee, you know, kind of. And so basically, I kind of just said if your regular wage income, PAYE, was the biggest part of your income, then you should be a regular wage earner. So the self-employed is difficult. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the second problem is like, now you've got two very different data sets. So how do you compare these distributions, particularly since the tax data had most of the bottom end lopped off? And yeah, the top end should be pretty much all there, whereas in the surveys, we're just getting a sample. So I used as a tool Jan Penn's Parade of Many Dwarves and a Few Giants. I'm not going to subject you to that now. I had an animation in here and when I did this presentation somewhere else. But the basic idea is we line people up from poorest to richest and basically just scale the diagram so that the height of that graph is proportional to the income. And then basically we put the two next to each other. So, but instead of doing it from poorest to richest, I did it from richest to poorest because I knew that I had the richest in the tax data. So we put the two next to each other, and then we look across what do these look like, and implicitly we're comparing people in the same rank of the distribution. So effectively we're saying we're getting roughly X million, 3 million taxpayers. So compare them to the 3 million richest people in the QLFS, using the weights, of course, in the QLFS. And this is what the diagram looks like. So this is kind of like logging it because otherwise, because of the skew, you can't see anything. And it turns out, yeah. So the red line is the QLFS. The beginning looks a little bit odd because given the fact that these are weighted data, there's really only a handful of observations. That's why it looks so completely flat. It's kind of like you know, one person with a weight of 50 is going to be up to rank 50, and then, you know, so on. So now what's kind of interesting is, so basically the tax data clearly has much higher initial level. It was capped there because, as Andrew said, in my case, they lopped that off. I didn't realize that they actually gave that to you. I was running SARS. I probably wouldn't give you the top earners in that data. I mean, I think that the risk, yeah, is non-trivial. There's a sort of anomalous bulge just between 100, rank 100 to 500 in the survey data, which are probably driven by imputations and some weird things in the weights. And then, but for a large chunk of the distribution, they seem to kind of like track each other. So they basically, they look very similar until the tax data drops off, because basically people don't need to file anymore once you hit the threshold, whereas the QLFS one dies off much more slowly. So basically what I wanted to do is zero in on those things where they track and calculate effectively, you know, what is the fraction of the one to the other, you know, so effectively what is the premium in the tax data relative to the QLFS data at various points. And that's tricky because effectively you've got a very sparse distribution for the sample. So most people hit empty space. You can't really do that, but effectively I did a smooth version of that local regression, and you just then impute for the missing points in between. And that's kind of what you get. So this is the premium. If you take tax data to QLFS earnings, you find there's an anomalous thing right at the beginning where the tax, not right at the beginning, but like on this log scale, this goes up to 3 million. So the top 2 or 5 or 10 or 100 don't show up on that graph. This is not a log scale at the bottom. So that bulge suggests that for a certain section, the QLFS actually has higher earnings than the tax data. But from the point where actually you've got enough data to compare, it's pretty clear that the tax data show a premium over the QLFS. So the blue line is regular earnings. So that suggests that we're missing about 20% for a lot of earners, and that sort of tails off as you get closer to the filing threshold. But once you start adding in cash bonuses and benefits, so you get the complete package, actually the QLFS data is probably among regular employees missing somewhere between 30 and 40%, which kind of squares with when I looked at those mine worker things in that previous table. But more importantly, this actually rises with earnings. You know, so basically the higher up you go, the earnings distribution, the bigger the missing portion in the QLFS relative to the tax data. So this is for people in regular earnings. So that's just my summary. Oh, I didn't put in the, this is kind of like, I didn't put in the self-employed into this graph. I got sidetracked and I missed. The self-employed actually look more interesting and different. So basically they're effectively, the QLFS seems to find more self-employment earnings in that range where it actually makes a big difference to your salary, but you don't yet earn enough that SARS is going to keep an eye on you, kind of like. So that you can find in the ready paper. I don't know how I truncated that distribution, that slide. So that's basically the data quality part of the workshop is done. Are there any questions?
Okay, I'll ask, then pass the mic to you. So there are a few questions on, so we've discussed the data quality on earnings in PALMS and the QLFS, to be specific. So there are questions whether there has been any study that has consistently analyzed employment trajectories. So this is stemming from Josh Badlander says they find discrepancies. The LCS and needs consistently have higher employment. So we saw that even during the COVID-19 pandemic with needs cram, the discrepancy between needs cram and the QLFS. So the assumption has been that needs might be the problem, but have we checked the GHS, the LCS, and how all those compare to the QLFS in terms of employment trajectories?
Have I done that? No, I think is the bottom line. Andrew's shaking his head, so Andrew's not done it. So I think that's a sign that no, we haven't looked at that in DataFirst. So the employment numbers we've looked at, I think the last time we looked at that was probably around about 2012, 2013, 2014. That ILO report asked about employment numbers, and
so this goes back to even before COVID. So even
there wasn't
after the financial crisis, there was also a discrepancy.
Yeah, so I don't know. So I've never really worked on the NIDS labor stuff. So I'm not in best position to comment on that. So
it's an opportunity for
anybody else,
a researcher who wants to compare.
So I think Josh is trying to tell us that he wants to do this and he wants to make sure that he's going to do original work. Go for it, Josh. We'd like to hear what you have to say.
And Jabulile asked why there was a drop in the total number employed using the tax data between 2014 and 15 and 2017-18. So those tax years.
Well, so basically one of the sort of obvious things when you think about tax data is people file and they give you stuff if they think they're going to get into trouble if they don't, so basically if the tax organization is coming apart at the seams, then you're not going to file. So it's incentives, so it's kind of like, when you think about incentives and answering questionnaires, same things apply, it has an incentive to file a tax return. So we know that there were big increases in tax gathering unrelated to the economic conditions in the, the late 90s, 2000s, because SARS was becoming a ruthless and slick machine, kind of like, so basically there's a whole lot of people who decided, well, I actually better get my tax affairs in order. And I think that things went pear-shaped in 2014 onwards. Well, I don't think we need to puzzle about why that happened. So, I mean, one of the questions, of course, is that's if people file for themselves. So firms, you would still expect, on the whole, they don't have a big incentive in, so if people are doing PAYE, typically I think firms would continue to do that simply because the bureaucracy is set up to do that regardless. But my guess is that, again, small firms, if you think the tax man's not looking, you're not going to file even for your employees. I'm just speculating here. This is called spitballing, but that's, I think, how, otherwise known as bullshitting, but that's how a lot of economics gets done.
So I think this is during Andrew's presentation, there was a comment about the GHS in 2020 not being any better. So Neil Rue has commented that the GHS collected outstanding telephone numbers in 2021. So once the limited physical contact was possible again. So yeah,
well,
just
that's
putting
good news.
It out there.
Thanks, Neil. And I'm glad that you're listening. We do appreciate the work that you guys do. Sometimes it looks like DataFirst bashes Stats South Africa, but we're actually very fond of you on the whole. No, it's true. It's an exemplary stats organization compared to pretty much most others. So there are a lot of people sitting in other countries who don't have access to the type of data that we do. Yeah. And I see a couple of nods in the audience. So yeah.
So taking you back to where we started this morning, is there such thing as extreme weight? Let's say you have different surveys, and in one of the surveys, you notice that there are certain people who are maybe representing 20,000 other people, but the ballpark seems to be way lower than that. So is there such a thing as extreme weight, and how do you go about it? And then the next question, the last question for the day for me is from to Andrew is, you've mentioned something that I've really been grappling with for a long time. Like for the Kenyan data, you find that people who report something like the whole day they earned 1 shilling, which of course is impossible. So I wanted to know what's the equivalent of what we're using Pareto. What's the equivalent of Pareto for like the lower end of the distribution, so that I can be able to say I'm going to cut this and justify why I'm cutting maybe 5% of the data, because I think it's just not feasible for someone to say they earned 1 shilling. Yeah, thank you.
So Andrew, while you think about that, I'm going to talk about extreme weights. Yeah, so extreme weights do exist. So I created quite a few of them myself in NIDS. And that's, yeah, so a lot of stats organizations will trim them. So basically they get produced in the process, and then they say, well, but we don't want to give anybody such an extreme weight. Let's cut them, kind of like, and the idea is that basically, if you've got a person with such an extreme weight, if you run an analysis where that person really swings your thing, you're doing something stupid, is my view on it. Like, kind of like, you know, so I kind of thought that we're all adults in the room. So if I release a data set with extreme weights, it's kind of your responsibility to kind of like check, you know, what the weights do on a particular analysis. And if one person with a weight of several thousand is swinging your analysis, then you're actually in the area we probably shouldn't be doing that analysis. So trimming the weights and stopping that from happening means that that problem is not going to bite you, but then you're still going to end up doing a stupid analysis. I mean, it's kind of like, it's a small sample problem effectively that you've got, which just gets blown up and becomes a real issue because of the weights, you know. So I actually have an example where I literally was asked by somebody who was writing a paper saying, you know, fortunately nobody in my department, but it was somebody from elsewhere looking at European immigrants in NIDS, you know, so basically people are born abroad, but who are now showing up in the NID sample. You're going to really work out, you know, that this can only be a maximum of like about 40 people for the entire country, kind of like, but there was another filter they placed on it, and they're saying, oh, if they're doing the unweighted analysis, they're getting fine results, but the moment they put the weights on, they're getting strange things. And I said, well, you should go shoot yourself. I didn't say that, but like, that's not an analysis that makes sense in any state of the universe, you know, whether you put the weights on or not. I mean, that's such a small subsample of, you know, that actually to think that those 40 people in NIDS can tell you anything about that population. I mean, you really need your head right. So, yeah, so extreme weights will, in a case like that, are really going to do some wonderful and weird things to your stuff. But even if you have the weights kind of trimmed so that you don't have that problem, you shouldn't be doing it. You know, so that's one answer. But I think that I've also learned over time that maybe actually prevention is worth a whole bunch of cure. So when Nicola and I worked on the weights when it's crammed, the household parts of that, we did trim the weights, right? Because we didn't want people to do, so you might get stupid results, but they're just not going to look quite so stupid as they do with the extreme weights. Yeah.
On the what to do at the bottom end, that's not an area that
problem,
yeah. In the tax data, I just dropped all the people at less than 2,000 per year because SARS said that was the mandatory amount above which you needed to file a tax certificate for your employee. And that's very different from your informal sector, self-employed people in Kenya. So yeah, I don't have much. Sorry, can't give you any good answers.
I had a question and a comment. So the question is, Andrew, when you were looking at the job flows by quartile, I think, was there any look at the age groups of those people to see whether the job flows are more prominent among people that were just entering the labor market, whereas if you were older, you may become more established and stay at a firm for longer? That was the one. And then the comment was, I don't remember the spike in the tax. If it was 2016, 17, there was a tax amnesty for people who had foreign assets. Those would probably be a lot of wealthy people that were paying a lot of tax that year. If that's when it was, I think, but I don't know.
No. So I was looking at 2011 data.
Okay,
was,
cool.
Only,
there wasn't age or gender. There is now. So that question could be answered, but now I guess, but I couldn't answer that. Yeah, in the data that I had access to. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting and important question.
Any more questions? Yeah, so I was going to do a formal closing session, which my slides were not ready for. So I'm going to do an extempore 5 minutes worth of wrap up. So the types of problems that we deal with are kind of quite diverse. And there is actually a framework which I got introduced to by Riza in the course of doing his PhD, which is effectively went into this book, which is getting published, which is called the Total Survey Errors Framework, so TSE. If you get Riza's book, that's pretty early on. A diagram is a very useful way of thinking about that. And basically, there are, I'm not going to click through all of the possibilities now, but it's a way of separating out. So if one thinks about the sampling, the measurement side, you start off with the population. So you then ask, who appears on the sampling frame, so maybe there's an initial problem just going from who's in the population to the sampling frame. Then you get from the frame, you get to the actual sample. So who's drawn in the sample, I should say. So that's the only thing that actually gets taught in standard econometric courses is sampling error, which is effectively when you do your normal kind of confidence intervals around stuff. That's basically because a sample could have been different. But from the people that got should have appeared in your sample, then you get the non-response issue. So basically, so effectively, how do you deal with that? And then what post-processing happens in the office? Kind of like, so it's the weighting adjustments, the calibration, whatever. So that's all on effectively the side of the kind of people that end up in your data and how that gets represented. Then there's another side that you want to think about, which is actually the concept, the construct which you're actually dealing with. So it could be earnings is a good example. There's a theoretical construct, but then there's the issue now, how does that get converted into questions, and what do those questions concretely look like? And we know, of course, that as they change, what you measure changes. So basically, that's, but even once you've got that captured in a set of questions in the survey, then fieldwork happens. So fieldworker has to go out with the with those questions and administer them in the field. And the first thing, of course, that you can get is the person who answers it misanswers it. That's kind of called measurement error. And that's also one of the things that we do think about in econometrics, kind of like, but then you have all of the capturing stuff that happens subsequently. So basically between what the person responded, what the field worker wrote down, how that got then onto the system, a lot of glitches happen. We know that. So basically the extra zeros on earnings that lead to the bogus millionaires that happened back in the office that probably didn't happen in the field. And then you have the whole paraphernalia of dealing with the missing data. So basically it's kind of reprocessing that information that's come, and imputations, whether it's hot tech or whatever, that happen. And in different ways, what we talked about is different parts of that total survey error framework. So basically not all parts of it, but the total survey error framework is at least a way of systematically clicking through and thinking, where can things go wrong? And I guess the bottom line of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is it can go wrong on pretty much any of the above. What that means ultimately is that when the statistic gets spit out at the end, there's uncertainty which goes beyond the stuff that we normally put around it, which is the sampling error uncertainty. And that sometimes those additional uncertainties dwarf what sampling error is about. And it's kind of like, it's important to bear that in mind, particularly if you're playing in the policy arena and they want definite answers. Has this gone up or down? Saying, well, maybe not, is generally not an answer that they want to hear, but sometimes actually that would be a more honest response. So we also want to do not just like, in a sense, diagnose where the errors are, but I mean, in some cases, there are things that you can actually do to improve the accuracy of that entire flow, that entire system. So that is part of where we see our work as being, is that at the end of the day, if you're an analyst, you're trying to do some work that firstly understand better what you're actually dealing with. What is that animal that you've got in front of you? The more you understand it in some senses, the better. But also that there are better ways of analyzing the data that we have, and worse ways, and we really would like the good data ultimately to drive out all the BS that gets produced on these data sets. And that's just basically where we are. One of the other things that I do want to encourage you to do is that if there are questions that lend themselves to further investigation, we're not a bespoke troubleshooting team for people, kind of like, we have our own lives to live. So basically we have enough troubles, believe you me. But if there are interesting things that one can take on with other people or whatever, we are always interested in, in kind of thinking how things could be done better. And even when we ourselves produce weights, kind of when we don't want to exempt ourselves from being checked, so that comment I made about who's quality checking the quality checkers is a fair enough comment. We want to be checked. Well, not always, but at the end of the day, the only way we'll improve is basically if we are fairly transparent about what we do. And with that, thanks for sitting through the day. We are now pretty much bang on time for the book launch. So that will be up in the staff lounge. It was initially advertised for the foyer, but the numbers were looking lower than we expected. We thought we'd get pretty much every economics PhD student wanting to gate crash a free party, but that doesn't seem to have been happening. So yeah, it's going to be up in the staff lounge and that'll happen shortly. Yeah. Are there any questions, comments just before we close the session? We are sort of into injury time. Okay, then just as a final thing, just a vote of thanks to the AV guys. Thanks for dealing with us. We were a little bit disorganized, so we'll work out how to get the input out to people. Thanks to Jackie for being on Zoom. And in the absence, I want to thank Alison, who had got a couple additional grey hairs over the last couple of weeks dealing with me and with various things that I asked her to organize. But she is amazing and she requires, yeah, thanks for that. That's it.